All right. So to start us off, I wanted to have a brief discussion about heat harms, both how they're experienced and how they manifest. So I think in reflecting on just generally talking broadly, what is heat? I think that we can all agree we have like a sensation in mind when we first think about heat rather than like a Webster's dictionary definition. That being said, heat is thermal. So, talking about heat as a form of thermal energy, we can measure this both in our environment as well as in our bodies. We have thermostats, we have thermometers. Yet, everyone experiences heat differently. This is going to be a common theme. Each of us has a different threshold for our heat tolerance, and this is influenced by our environment, our biology, and even our cultures. So, the difference in heat experience can, as I mentioned before, be related to the environment. Not all heat is the same, and it's influenced by a number of factors such as our humidity or our wind speed. In the case of humidity, obviously, to take, for example, 97 degrees Fahrenheit, which should be a standard number, it's an objective measure. It's very different when you're looking in Arizona versus when you're looking in Louisiana. This is a contribution because of the wet heat, which really just describes a higher percentage of water vapor in the air. Important to this slide is that water, really in any form, including these vapor particles, will trap heat. So when the air is already saturated with this vapor, our sweat, which is a main cooling mechanism in the body, will not evaporate as quickly. The less evaporation, the greater the perceived heat. Wind speed, similar mechanism. We have this speeding up evaporation by really circulating the air and also speeding up the evaporation of our sweats, our thermoregulatory measure. Then latitude and altitude, interestingly, they're inversely related to heat. As we both increase in latitude and altitude, the relative heat will decrease. And this is due to the hair receiving and holding less heat, respective to both latitude and then altitude. We then have mitigating or protective factors, such as our bodies of water and greenery or shade. Um, Water, as I mentioned before, will trap heat. So the larger the body of water, the more thermoregulation that we experience. Additionally, green spaces not only offer shade from the direct thermal energy of the sun, but they can also cool the nearby environment through a process of their own water loss through foliage. It's almost like their form of sweating, and their vapor that they produce similarly can trap heat and expel it into the environment. That being said, a lot of our green spaces are disappearing. They're being replaced by urbanization and destroying our natural environment. In the case of asphalt and concrete, they are not transferring they're not dissipating the heat as effectively, and rather, in their own way, trap it, causing a local heat island. This is increasingly an issue and disproportionately not only impact inner city populations, but also poor communities due to this inequitable urban planning. We also want to really focus on this when we talk about communities that are disproportionately impacted, because we also see this as a demographic pattern within communities of higher minority population. So, as I transition to the next slide, we've already mentioned sweating as one measure of heat regulation. However, our body also has a number of other tricks to keep us cool. Uh, this is all really routed through a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which interprets our sensory inputs and translates it into outputs, whether this is autonomic or uh, not perceived by our mind. We don't have to think to create these effects in our body, or through our behavior, such as drinking water, wearing lighter clothing. We also, in terms of those autonomic responses, not only have sweat, but we also have heat dissipating through vasodilation and the opening or recruiting of more pore opening. And then, as previously mentioned, we have behavioral responses as well. That being said, regulation reaches a threshold that it could compensate for. As this heat progressively outweighs our body to metabolically regulate, we're unable to remove this heat as effectively, and we both lose water and salt through our sweat. This combination of factors leads to symptoms of heat exhaustion that we see on our right-hand side, such as the faintness or dizziness, or the nausea and vomiting. This is due to dehydration, effects on the nervous system, and effects on our organ systems. These effects really culminate and spiral once we hit symptoms of a heat stroke. Our organs begin to really feel this weight of the physiological strain, including our cardiovascular system and our kidneys, which can lead to serious damage or even long-term health consequences. This is because both our cardiovascular system and our kidneys have to shunt away blood from the central area to our periphery to allow for this heat dissipation and to cool down our core body temperatures. We can even see brain hypoperfusion, where it receives less oxygen or blood, though it can compensate to an extent, or muscle breakdown in the cases of extreme heat. So, heat stroke, you see really a further dysregulation, such as body temperature above 103 degrees Fahrenheit, or the body no longer able to sweat because the hypothalamus becomes dysregulated. We'll talk about this a little bit more and how heat really affects the brain specifically. So the physiology that we're seeing within the brain is very diverse. We not only have this ability, loss of ability to thermoregulate, but we also have that blood shunting. The blood that was in the center of our bodies perfusing our organs now moves to the periphery because we're able to cool down. This can also decrease blood flow and oxygen to the brain, as well as other organs. Though I do say this with a big asterisk, there have been mixed studies that have shown the ability to compensate by the brain producing its own oxyhemoglobin. This is oxygenated blood. That being said, these compensatory mechanisms take away energy from other necessary tasks and require a higher level of energy to just maintain baseline functioning. Also, as a response to heat, we have a breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. We have higher permeability due to the increase in volume within both fluids and gases in response to heat. And this can also lead to stuff such as pathogen leakage, where we have viruses, bacteria, things that are not good for our brain passing through our nervous system. We'll also see inflammation, which is the body's immune response, or edema, which is a form of fluid trapping and could lead to brain swelling. All of these things will impact neuronal integrity. Not only that, but heats can impact our neuronal firing, our rate, our efficiency, and also how they communicate amongst each other, whether locally or globally within the brain. So, heat has a negative impact on brain physiology, to sum it up. Not only that, but it also relates to decrease in our function, our cognitive and mental functioning, but also our body's ability to create this negative feedback loop to prevent this from happening further. So then we get stuck in a spiral of sorts. Also, when talking about brain health, I really want to quickly talk about serotonin. Serotonin's roles are complex and ubiquitous, especially when talking about psychiatry. We have not just its role in mood and thought and behavior, but it also influences our sleep-wake cycles, our circadian rhythms. Also has a relation to our sensation of pain, our nociception, or even our learning, or in this case, thermoregulation. There is a link between thermoregulation and serotonin, though it's not a direct or necessarily a simple relationship. But serotonin will influence how we perceive the environment. And not only this, but serotonin also responds to heat. There have been a couple of studies that have shown decreased serotonin production in response to excess heat. Because of its role in behavior and a tentatively described relationship between temperature and serotonin production and distribution, it's hypothesized that this neurotransmitter, this chemical in the brain, will account for a wide range of the impacts we're seeing in extreme heat. To break this down a little further, I had mentioned memory, our cognition, a thought process, our mood, our emotional state. I've also mentioned our sleep, not just through serotonin, but heat has a number of consequences to our sleep. And then, as a result of these factors and others, we see both interpersonal violence and violence to the self in the form of suicide or self-harm. So, looking at mood first, I want to point out that we have a lot of these sayings that we see here that, if I could get a quick show of hands, how many of you have seen just one of these sayings? He's so hot-headed, he's hot-tempered, so angry that they make my blood boil, hot under the collar. Okay, so we're all very familiar with these sayings in some way, shape, or form. Seeing a lot of hands. So while heat doesn't affect everyone equally, we still have this constellation of individual experiences that creates a common theme or pattern. We see this once really our threshold for tolerance or comfort has been surpassed by excess heat. Now, with these sayings, it's clear to see how temperature has not just influenced our mood, but so much so our vernacular, our colloquialisms, and our expressions. So these come and reflect from this change in mood when exposed to high temperatures. We're going to get into some of the studies behind some of these mood disturbances. However, we do see a link between heat and increased aggression. That being said, I do want to point out that this isn't always anger. Anger is like a classic association with heat. However, I was researching before this talk and I found that actually one paper coming out of China had looked at a relationship between Google searches or sorry, internet searches for depression and anxiety in response to increased temperatures. They saw that an increased average temperature, which I apologize, I don't have the exact number on hand, did correlated with a 22 up to 22% rise in public searches for depression and anxiety. These are other mood disorders. These are other subjective feelings of our well-being, not related or indirectly related to anger. So we experience things differently. However, heat has really worked its way into our common understanding of mood. Looking at some additional studies, I mentioned anger because some studies have shown this effect in the form of aggression, in the form of our behavior that results from mood. While the study I show here has a snapshot of the USA statistics, this was done across multiple countries. So this is not specifically a cultural phenomenon where you have an associated or where you have an increase in our environmental temperature being positively correlated with an increase in violent crime. We can also see this with domestic violence. There's further studies that support that as temperature increases, there's increased domestic violence. There's also increased violence against women and children. Again, there are certain groups that are disproportionately impacted by not only the environmental heat, but the human response and our behaviors that are driven by this temperature. We also see this in the form of rape. Again, a positive correlation with temperature. Um, and then we also see this with violent retaliation in sports. Just three individual measures, but that really offer a snapshot of this behavioral response. For example, with this violent retaliation, you'll see pitchers making more aggressive plays, even striking the batter directly. These have been noted not just statistically, but anecdotally as well. and have been supported across multiple studies. Moving beyond violence to others, I do want to touch on violence to self. This is a study snapshot here um, that kind of jumps off of my earlier study coming out of China, mentioning an impact of heat on mood disorders, or at least perceived well-being. Here we have startlingly, unexpectedly, a 0.7% increase in suicide rates for every 1 degree Celsius over the monthly average temperature when seen in the United States. This increases in Mexico to 2.1% increase per 1 degree Celsius. These might be seemingly small changes, but when we look at these effects over a population, we start to see a trend. And unfortunately, this trend is so directly correlated that there's even been one projection that there might be anywhere in the range of 21,000 more suicides by 2050. This is not just one group, one country. This is across all socioeconomic levels. Not only that, but jumping off on further insights, this author has attributed these increase in suicide rates to um, a number that will actually surpass the number of lives that we can expect to be saved from efforts such as suicide prevention and gun control. That's startling. That's not only showing that we have this direct relationship between heat and suicide rates, harm to self, but moreover, that effects that we're seeing in well-being across other domains of public health are not sufficient when looked at in isolation. One possible hypothesis for this, to just throw in a mechanism of action, has been looked at with the frontal lobe functioning. A possible decrease in that frontal lobe functioning, which kind of controls our executive reasoning and subsequently restrains our amygdala arousal. So we'll look at this further when we look at cognition. So I think we've covered a lot of this already. We have this impact on cognition, slower response times, reduced attention span, and impaired decision making. This is not just accuracy, but also riskier decision making. I will say, as an asterisk, sometimes slower response time can be actually inversely related, where we have a speed accuracy trade-off. We make less accurate decisions, but at a quicker speed to get out of this discomfort of heat. This can be caused by the cerebral blood flow redistribution, that neuron connectivity or activation, as I had previously mentioned, increased stress hormones such as cortisol produced in response to heat, changes in the oxygenation of the brain, or having to go through those compensatory measures, or the effect on the sleep-wake cycle. Touching on that real quick, we have measured effects on the sleep-wake cycle in response to heat that can be broken down by its phases. We've seen both reduced slow wave sleep and decreased rapid eye movement, or REM sleep. These are responding to the environment, but that also that also can harm us in how we respond, ultimately through our memory, emotional regulation, and detoxification during the night. We also see more frequent sleep interruptions and increased body movements, especially in the elderly. And as we all know, sleep is important not just for mood and thought, but also other organ functions, and can result in increased mortality and morbidity. So just to sum it up once more, individuals feel heat differently. So it's important to look at individual population effects like we're about to do.